Ready for chapter 4 lecture video? Much later in the day. I've already done a whole bunch of tutoring and my family's in the other room talking and continuing to watch Tank Girl, which is what I was watching. So if I go a lot, it's because I'm getting slightly distracted, but I want to get this out there so then I can finish chapter 15 and have everything there for you. So we're there, almost. Okay, origin of the species. Now, this chapter lecture video, there we go, that's a whole thing. This goes very well with your speciation lab. So if you have not done the speciation lab yet, this is the one that will help you better understand it, hopefully. So these birds, known as bowerbirds, it's the picture in there. These birds are named for the structure they make. Why does this matter? Well, because it's kind of showing a speciation kind of thing. So these guys, certain ones build certain ways, and how they build it is what attracts the mate. So at the end of the chapter 13 lecture, we were talking about sexual selection and stuff like that. This jumps into there. So we're going to talk more about what makes them branch off into two different things. So big ideas, defining species and mechanisms of speciation. All right, so here we go. We were talking before about microevolution, teeny tiny changes. This is like in the gene pool and stuff like that. Speciation is the process where one species splits into two or more. This is what actually counts a lot for both unity and diversity. Yeah, don't know how else to say that. Checkpoint question. There's a lot of checkpoint questions in this one. So, how does microevolution differ from speciation? Right here. Microevolution involves the evolutionary changes within the population. But speciation occurs when a population changes enough that it diverges, it splits away from the parent species and becomes a new one. So one teeny tiny little bitty changes in the gene pool basically, and the other one, the whole population just changes enough that it becomes its own thing. I had no reason to keep this slide in other than I just thought it was kind of cool. This is a sketch made by Darwin as he was coming up with his idea of origin of the species, and so you can see this is a rudimentary phylogeny tree, similar to what we looked at in the previous chapter. Now, different ways to define a species. When I talk about this, normally I talk about the Arctic char. The Arctic char is a type of fish. And the cool thing about it, I love to use it as an example because a lot of people used to just simply look at things and go, oh, it looks like that, so it must be related to this, that kind of thing. The Arctic char, you can grow them, basically raise them in a lab, take a whole bunch of them and chuck them into a lake. And to basically keep from competing with each other, you will have some that go more towards the shoreline, some that are more towards the bottom, and then some that are just kind of around in the free area of the lake. Over a couple of generations, they will morphologically change. Their bodies, the way they look, will change. They will adapt. They will eat different foods. Their mouth parts will adapt for the food choice of their location, stuff like that. If you go back and catch a fish from this area, and this area, they're all going to look different. But if you then take those fish back to the lab, go through a couple of generations of reproducing, you will end up with the original one. The reason I think this is interesting is because it kind of makes you realize it's harder to define what a species is. Because you can't just look at it and go, oh yeah, it must be that. You can't just look at the location where it is and go, oh, it must be that. So I think that's kind of cool. So the biological species concept. They say that a species is a group of populations whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring with each other, but not with members of other species. This means that they cannot have babies with anything else. The small change to this will be hybrids. So like a mule, A mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. But the thing is, notice this says produce fertile offspring. The mule tends to be sterile, can't have babies, so it's not a fertile offspring. So that still shows that a horse is a different species than a donkey. And pretty sure we talked about that in Bio 123. This concept emphasizes something called reproductive isolation. It means that they are isolated from others in how they reproduce. Sometimes, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, sometimes it's because of location. Sometimes it's literally part A does not work with part B. And other times it's behavioral. So there's a lot of different ways you can be reproductively isolated. Now, talked about the morphological species concept, which is about the Arctic char. The morphological species concept based on observable physical traits. So you can look at it and go, oh, yep, it must be that. Because pretty much when you look at something that's asexual, you can't look at their reproduction. And for fossils, it's not like you know whether or not officially a Triceratops could reproduce with, I don't know, a Brontosaurus. It seems weird, but there's no way to actually know. So for that, you have to look at the morphological species concept. Then you have the ecological species concept. This is where they define the species by its ecological niche. This is where it's the very specific locations. So this kind of will go along with your speciation lab. And then the phylogenetic species concept. This will define a species as the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor, and so they form only one branch on the tree of life. This means when you looked at that phylogeny tree, the one we looked at in chapter 13, and we had the common ancestor, and then it branched off and you had crocodiles here, and then you had ostriches here. That's what that part's talking about. Checkpoint question. Which species concepts could you apply to both asexual and sexual species? I'm going to let you think on that. Here's one that you have to look at. If you go by just the morphological, are all of these from the same species? I would think so, because we are all Homo sapiens. These are all humans. So you would assume these are all the same species. Each of these people presumably live in different locations. They all look different, but we are all human. Then we have the bears. Grizzly bear, polar bear, and the growler bear. The growler bear is a mix between the grizzly bear and the polar bear. So the question here is, these guys don't look so much different as the people, but we say Homo sapiens, all humans are the same species, but are these bears the same species? This is why it can get kind of crazy. I love this chapter though. So much fun. Now, we have the reproductive barriers. There's a couple of different types, and so we're going to talk about them. Reproductive barriers are there in order to isolate the gene pools of species and to prevent interbreeding. Because again, we don't want that gene pool to be too close. We don't want it to be where all of the horses are always reproducing with all of the donkeys, so we get a lot of mules, but then we run out of horses and donkeys. So that's where this comes into play. Depending on whether they function before or after the zygote forms, that is what indicates whether the barriers are prezygotic or postzygotic. Prezygotic means before the zygote. And so that would be right around the fertilization time. Postzygotic means it happens after fertilization, pretty much. So here you go. We have gametes from mom, gametes from dad, because they're always going to be, unless it's asexual, there's always going to be mom and dad. So we have the two gametes. Prezygotic barriers are going to be if their habitats are nowhere near each other. Temporal isolation. This means like these guys are active at night and these are active during the day. If something is a night I started saying a night crawler. If something's only out at night, it's not going to reproduce with something that's only out during the day. Behavioral isolation. Oh, and temporal can also be like mating season is in June and then mating season is in, I don't know, August. That's a big time difference, and so those are not going to interbreed. Behavioral isolation. This is going to be like the bird at the very beginning of the PowerPoint. Or there are certain songbirds. There are different animals that have very specific mating rituals where they're trying to attract the mate. I had a professor, his name's Dr. Beckler, and he would talk about the Lovespiel, and which basically means the mating dance. But he would do this every single time. It was so cute. Anyway, that would be the behavioral. Mechanical isolation. This is literally the one I was talking about where the two parts don't match. So mechanical isolation would be something along the lines of A and B just straight up don't fit. So you would not be able to, I don't know, let's see, have a naked mole rat and a porcupine. They're not going to be able to reproduce because that naked mole rat can't get near that porcupine. You know what I mean? Okay, then we have gametic isolation. This just means straight up the two gametes cannot blend. That means that sperm is not possible to fertilize that egg. That's pretty much what that is. Now, if we get past the prezygotic barriers and we make a zygote, so there is a baby forming, that's when you get to the post-zygotic barriers. Reduced hybrid viability. That means a lot of the babies won't even make it to term. So there'll be a lot of, I hesitate to say miscarriage, but that's pretty much what it is. Reduced hybrid fertility. That would be what is in the case of the mule. A lot of them just straight up won't be fertile. And then hybrid breakdown. Hybrid breakdown means that the body is just kind of breaking down a lot faster than it should. Think of like enlarged heart that can't stay in that body, and so the heart explodes or whatever. It's that kind of thing. And at the very end, you have a few viable fertile offspring. There you go. So, checkpoint question. Two closely related fish live in the same lake, but one feeds along the shoreline and the other is a bottom feeder in deep water. This is an example of what type of isolation, which is what? There you go. It's habitat isolation. It might be the same lake, but one stays on the bottom of the lake and one is up here on the shoreline. So totally different habitats. So that counts as a prezygotic reproductive barrier. And here's just some examples of some pre and post-zygotic barriers. Yeah, feel free to take a good look. That's all I'm going to really worry about. And there's that mule I was talking about with the sterile hybrids. Mechanisms of speciation. Okay, we have allopatric speciation, which is pretty much what your speciation lab is going to be about. Geographically separated from other populations, small population may become genetically unique as its gene pool is changed by natural selection, mutation, or genetic drift. We talked about all three of those in chapter 13. This, though, is that the allopatric speciation means that it's geographically separated. So like there's a mountain range in between the two. Or I think in chapter 13, I made reference to having a field. Yeah, it was about the mice. And then somebody puts a street right in the middle. That will be a geographic isolation. Yet another checkpoint question. I told you there's a whole bunch in this one. Geologic evidence indicates that the Isthmus of Panama gradually closed about 3 million years ago. Genetic analysis indicate that the various species of snapping shrimp originated from 9 to 3 million years ago, with the species pairs that live in deepest water diverging first. that means the ones that are at the deepest water, they're the ones who became separate species first. How would you interpret these data? Well, the deeper species would have been separated into two isolated populations first, because it's not like when everything happened, it just went instantaneously. As the Panama gradually closed, it would have been like this. And so the bottom would be the first part that's coming up, because I think we talk a little bit about plate tectonics in either this one or it might be chapter 15. But basically, how mountains are formed and how this would have worked is you've got the plates, and they're going like this, and then when they press up against each other, it's because the plates just kind of run into each other. Other times it can go like this. But either way, it's going to start from the bottom and work its way up. So the ones deepest got separated first, hence became separate species first. All right, this is also an example of allopatric speciation between these little squirrels. Aren't they cute? The south rim and the north rim, very similar, but they're different species because they have changed slightly. Look at the difference. Their colors are a little bit different and stuff because they got separated by the canyon. And then these are the snapping shrimp that we were just talking about. All right, how do reproductive barriers arise? Well, environment of the isolated population might be due to different food sources, different types of pollinators, different predators. We talked previously, chapter 13, about the different food sources and how that can completely change when I was talking about Darwin and the finches. And so in order to survive, they evolved a different beak. So you would have ones that would eat the seeds, the nuts, the bugs, stuff like that. And I think we might have a picture in this PowerPoint, maybe, about finches and their beaks. Other times, different types of pollinators. You have flowers that have evolved to have specialized pollinators. So, birds, bees, that kind of thing. There was actually an orchid that was so specially evolved, it co-evolved with this one type of bee that it evolved a very specific way, so only this one bee could pollinate it. But the issue is the bee started to die out, but since they were so perfectly matched, as the bee died out, the orchid started to die out as well because nothing else could pollinate it. That is coevolution, by the way, co for both, where both of them evolved together. And then we, of course, have different predators. Different predators are going to pick off different things, which can cause a verge. All right, researchers have documented the beginning of reproductive isolation in fruit fly populations adapting to different food sources. What this is, if you look in your book, they show these fruit flies where they fed some starch and some, I can't remember what the other one was, but it was starch and something. I want to say it started with an M, maybe it was molasses, I'm not sure. But what they found were the fruit flies that fed off of this, like type A, they ended up reproducing almost exclusively with the other fruit flies that had the same diet, same with the others. So they were showing that just the food source can completely separate them, even though they're just fruit flies. And then researchers have also identified a gene for flower color involved in the pollinator choice that helps separate monkey flower species. Flower color is key. So is scent. I always find this interesting, and I think I talk about this more when we get to plants, but the way plants, I was about to say choose, they don't really choose, but you know what I mean. The way plants get their various pollinators is either by sight or by smell. So if you pick a flower and it has a scent, then that is pollinated by bees or bugs or flies, because those are scent attractants. If there is no scent but it's brightly colored, that's a bird, because birds have no sense of smell. And so that's what this I thought was pretty interesting. think I'm going to show a picture of the flowers in a little bit. Females of the Galapagos finch, there's the name, respond to the songs of males from their island, but ignore songs of males from other islands. How would you interpret these findings? Do you think this might be a reproductive barrier? It's that whole behavioral thing we were talking about just a little while ago. They respond only to their specific song, and that ensures that their little group species continues. And here are the flowers I was talking about. Notice you have the pink one and it shows a little bee there, so that pollinator is going to be an insect. The orange one is an insect and a bird, but then notice the bright red one is just a bird. And then you have the dark pink one that is bird and insect. So some of these flowers evolved in order to attract another one. I would hesitate to say that they started off with the bird and then they developed a scent in order to also attract the insect to spread out more, but I don't know for sure. All right, now we have sympatric speciation. This is when a new species arises within the same geographic area as its parent species. So many plant species evolve by polyploidy, poly for many. And think also, remember haploid and diploid. Haploid is one, diploid is two, polyploidy is many. So what happens here is there's a duplication of the chromosome number due to errors. It's oops, basically, in the cell division. So mutation, if you will. And then it can just continue. So there you go. Biologists can test hypotheses about the process of speciation by studying species that arose recently. So what they do is they look at the more recent species in order to figure these out. Cichlids, it's a type of fish. That's what they tend to work on here to figure out about sexual selection. Now, what lines of evidence support the conclusion that sexual selection led to reproductive isolation between these two fish? Here you go. These are the two fish in question. That's the location. The mate choice experiments performed in the laboratory, and the difference in color vision of females of the two species, and difference in breeding location. So they looked at what was happening, the colors, what colors they could see, and the location. That is how they went, oh, this is why these are two totally different species, even though if you look at them, honestly, other than color, they look a lot alike. But I mean, they're fish, right? Okay. Evolution of many diverse species from a common ancestor is known as adaptive radiation. That means you have the one change and it's adjusted and it radiates out. It just goes and keeps going. Repeated isolation, speciation, and recolonization events on isolated island chains have led to adaptive radiations of species. Many of these found nowhere else in the world. So there's something about that area that makes it spread out. So, explain why isolated island chains provide opportunities for adaptive radiations. I give you a hint here where I say, like mentioned in the chapter 13 lecture, this would be those finches. So here you go. I knew I had a picture of the finches in here. They have it zoomed in so you can actually see their beaks. They're all just finches, but very, very specialized beaks. The top one is the ground finch, and it eats seeds. Then you have the woodpecker finch that eats insects, and it has that curved, sharper, larger beak in order to literally poke, and then get the bugs. Then you have just the plain old regular insect eater, which is yet another finch. So this is an example how on one little area, island chain, you have these birds that all became their own different species through evolution in order to survive. So none of these eat the same bugs or things, because I have to say that because of the seed eater. They have completely different diets, so they do not reproduce with each other, but they're all finches. Okay, morphological, geographic, and genetic studies have provided a wealth of data on how and when new species of Darwin's finches emerged. So they've been looking and trying to read about this, and again, they're going through it to look at the effect of the natural selection on the beak size in real time. So pretty much these are people who are going, oh my gosh, he's right, but when did this happen? So, checkpoint question. Why was it important for the researchers to establish that beak morphology is heritable? Why do we need to know that the baby birds inherited their beak? Because natural selection can only modify heritable traits. This means that the bird did not hatch and then go, no, I think I want to live down here on the ground and eat seeds, and then their beak changed. It means it had to come from mom and dad. Okay, now we're going to get to hybrid zones. So what happens when separated populations of closely related species come back into contact with one another? Well, this is where we have hybrid zones. And I think there's one of these in the speciation lab as well. Hybrid zones are regions in which populations of different species overlap and produce at least some hybrid offspring. Over a period of time, the reinforcement may strengthen the barriers to reproduction, or it may reverse the speciation and they go back to normal. So this would be an example of the Arctic char I mentioned before. If you bring them back to the lab, they would eventually merge back. Other times they get even more specialized and they become farther away from her in basically a more solidified different species. In a stable hybrid zone, limited number of hybrid offspring continue to be produced. So it'll just keep happening on occasion. If you look at graphs of like the mating times, because I said that about the temporal prezygotic barrier, there are ones with frogs that overlap just a little bit, and each time it overlaps, you tend to get some hybrids right in there. So why might hybrid zones be called natural laboratories where you can study speciation? Well, it's right here. Because if you can study the fate of the hybrids over time, you can directly observe the factors that make it happen or make it not happen to have your complete isolation. So here it's showing that the new species, they're totally separated, but the hybrid zone is where the guys can actually still meet up, and we have a little bit of gene flow, and so it either settles back down and it merges back into one species, or it stays separate and we only have a couple of tiny guys. All right, now, two models for the tempo of speciation. We have punctuated equilibria. This one always sticks in my head because I remember ages and ages and ages ago, before I ever went to college or anything, I saw a bumper sticker and it said, honk if you understand punctuated equilibria. And that stuck in my head because I had no idea what it was. And I was like, what is this? And it drove me nuts. Anyway, punctuated equilibria. This describes an evolutionary pattern where the species change happens, bam. So, arise from an ancestral species and then change relatively little for the rest of their existence. So it's like a change and then it's just normal. Those tend to be harder to spot, and we have something coming up which will show that. Then we have the gradual pattern. This is what we tend to think of. I would say I tend to think more of this one, where it's slowly changing bit by bit by bit. So there you go. How does the punctuated equilibrium model account for the relative rarity of transitional fossils linking newer species to older ones? Well, here you go. This is why. Because when speciation takes place in a very short time, like punctuated pattern, it's harder to spot. If you look at this little picture here, you see the punctuated pattern. You have this one butterfly, and then you have two distinct different butterflies, like just like that. If you look at the more gradual one, you can see it slowly changing, and then by the end, they're clearly two different things, but you can kind of backtrack to see the change. Um, I don't know why, but what popped into my head, it's kind of like when you see a little kid learning to walk. You expect to see a step and then a fall and then a step and then a fall. You expect to see the child learn to walk until they're suddenly walking, and then it seemed perfectly logical. But if you see a kid who has never taken a step in their life just stand up and take off walking, you're like, what did I miss? So I kind of see it as that. All right, that thankfully is the end of chapter 14. This is one of the shorter ones. So much more I want to tell you about this. However, I'm not, because it might be covered in chapter 15. But by the end of chapter 15, we will be mostly caught up with all of our evolution portions, and then we will go through all the different organisms as we get up there. So yes, I know I'm not reading all this to you, but you can read it. It's not hard. I've read plenty already. And that brings me to our last one. So I only have one more chapter for this week. Week 1, we have chapters 13, 14, and 15. So this one is chapter 14. We're finished. The sun has not completely gone down yet. Yay. I didn't bother turning the light on in here, and I know it's slowly been getting darker, so I don't even know what you can see at this point. But whatever. Hopefully this was not too horribly painful, and Wednesday I will get chapter 15 up, and then I will be caught up. Yay! Yeah, that's it.